Hello, my name's Liza Norton and I'll be giving the nutrition mini lecture today. Disclaimer, I'm a dietitian and I'm also doing my PhD here at Griffith. So let's get into it. Okay, so just looking at what we'll discuss today, I'm going to go through 4 key elements in the talk. The first one's to have a look and understand the link between diet and excessive weight. I'll take a look at stigma, particularly around children. The second objective is to describe the link between food and the social determinants of health. The third, understand how environmental factors shape our food choices and what that might look like. And fourth, define what's an obesogenic environment. So what are they and what does it look like and why do they matter? Okay, so let's get straight into it. Just to start with, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I guess, categorisation, because when we say overweight and obesity, what do we mean? And I think clinically it's important to define it up front so that we've got the same understanding. Some of you might be aware that to define overweight and obesity in adults, something called the BMI is used, or the body mass index. We can work that out, getting someone's weight and height, and you can see the equation there. So weight divided by height squared. You'll come up with a figure. You might have done it for yourself, I'm not sure. And you can see there the chart gives us an idea of where that might sit. So, are we underweight? Are we in the normal weight? Are we overweight or obese? You can see the various categories there. It's a clinical tool, but it's just one tool. And I think we need to remember right up front that it does have its limitations. It's not fantastic with certain ethnic groups or older people. And if you try this equation with a rugby league player, you'll certainly work out that they're obese, and clearly they're not. So there are some limitations. As I said, it can't distinguish between fat and muscle, and this is an issue if we're just using this as a tool alone. Using the waist to hip ratio is another measure that might be used to look at abdominal fat, and typically used in a clinical setting. We're moving on to looking at children. We don't use the BMI straight in. So with kids between 2 and 18 years, we use a BMI centile chart. For those of you that haven't seen one, I've got one here on the slide, and you can see quite clearly that on the 85th centile, there we go, that first arrow, we're looking at, that's the category between 85 and 95 that you would say a child is overweight clinically. Once we get to the 95th and above, we would say that sits in the obese range. Now, I'm doing this to set the scene as to what we're actually talking about clinically. But I think we also need to factor in some other elements when we look at weight, because as I said, it's one measure. What does it look like in terms of overweight and obesity in our country? So what are the statistics for Australia? And if those of you have had a little think about this, I'm not sure how close you came to the mark, but in Australia, we're looking at 2 out of 3 adults. Around that 66% of adults are overweight or obese based on the categorisations I gave earlier. For kids, it is a bit less, it's 25% or 1 in 4. And so obviously something happens in that transition from childhood to adulthood in terms of culturally there. I'm not going to harbour the point, but what are we looking at in terms of diet and weight? What are the factors? It's not rocket science. Calories in, calories out. Sounds pretty simple. So calories in, we're talking about what we're eating, what we're drinking, what we're consuming. Calories out, the body function part is basically our basal metabolic rate. And that takes about 70% of the calories we consume are used for that. So even if you're in an ICU bed and you're lying flat on your back, you still need at least that 70 to 80, probably more actually, calorie-wise, just to keep everything going, keep your heart ticking. And also obviously the physical activity component, just walking around, sport, whatever you happen to be involved in, also is burning those calories. The statistics I mentioned before are from this guide, and feel free to have a look. It's in the reference list if you want some more information about the subcategories of overweight and obesity in our country. I'm going to move now into an area that's, I guess, emerged probably over the last 10 years as an issue and is taking hold in certain domains as to being quite significant. It's weight stigma. Some of you might know about weight stigma and term it as weight biased or weight discrimination. For the purposes of this discussion, the same thing. So what is it? Basically, it's a negative attitude, could be a negative behaviour towards a person because of their size, because they're overweight or obese. And certainly over the last few years, it's become a social justice issue and a public health issue. There's lots of assumptions that people are making about other people in larger bodies. And one of those is that they're lazy or they just lack the willpower. They're just, they're not motivated, I hear people say. We've got to be really careful, and I'm going to talk in a bit more detail as to why about weight stigma. And as health professionals, I know some of you are going to go into various professional roles, dentistry, nutrition, speech pathology. You'll be seeing lots of people, and let's face it, 2 out of 3 of them will probably be overweight or obese. So we need to talk about these issues. Weight stigma is discrimination. It's increasing, and it's a shame-based emotion and behaviour to scare people into doing something, i.e. dieting. A lot of it's fueled by the diet industry, a lot of it's fueled by fear. And if we think about the diet industry, it's about making money. So it's that cycle of people feel bad, they'll buy something to feel better. That might be the latest book by the celebrity chef who knows nothing about nutrition. Actually, that's another talk, don't get me started. But what I'm saying is that it fuels people to then make decisions that are not necessarily great for their health, but they're fearful. The media, they also reinforce weight stigma. And one of the things that I've been looking at recently is in our common sort of culture, Disney movies for instance, the baddie is often overweight. The baddie is mean. There's been some great research done asking 3-4-year-olds about what they think of certain body shapes. And often the little girls say, the big girl's the mean girl. So at 4, a child can tell you this. It's a learnt behaviour. So why am I passionate about it, and do I think it's a problem? Well, the research tells me it's a problem. The first thing is it doesn't encourage weight loss. So it doesn't work. So stigmatising people, making them feel bad, shaming them, they don't lose weight. It's not a good strategy. They don't improve their health. The outcomes are bad for kids. So bullying, teasing, you might think, oh, what's a bit of name calling? Name calling's an issue. It increases disordered eating. By disordered eating, I mean binging, I mean dieting. I mean kids say, oh, I'm going to stop eating because I'm fat. I've had quite a few kids come through that do have eating disorders, and it's come from this start. It's come from being teased. There's some literature that supports that the bullying and the teasing, either by peers or family members, even in jest, can be negative. Bad stuff. You can see I've got a little, it's a very basic little picture there that depicts if someone is getting weight-based teasing or stigmatising, they feel stressed about this. It increases their cortisol. They might be prone then to eat more if that's a coping mechanism. They gain more weight and the cycle continues. So any way you look at it, weight-based stigma is not a good thing. I looked at some literature, and around 30 correlational studies are there looking at the evidence between people's experience of weight stigma and then what behaviours this transpires into. More often than not, it's unhealthy eating behaviours, the sort of disordered eating that I mentioned prior. So if you think about it, if we're weight stigmatising people, we're moving them further into those negative behaviours. If that was a drug, or let's move someone further into heart disease and give them this pill, we wouldn't be doing it. So it's interesting that we need to rethink how we're working and talking with people. What can we do? Well, there's a few things we can do. This is a lovely paper by Poole, and she makes the point that we can all start with ourselves. So particularly if you are a health professional, we can start by our personal assumptions about body weight, health, appearance. We can challenge weight-based stereotypes. We can think about the language we use when we talk to people. You know, once upon a time it was fine to say, oh, we'll go and see the diabetic. Now we would say the person with diabetes. So we are moving away from that blame. We're shifting, and we need to do it more when it comes to weight. We need to model sensitivity, particularly young people and children, and we need them to have a sense of self, regardless of weight. Good document there from WHO. You can see there, weight biased and obesity stigma. This is from the Europeans. They've got some great ideas. And I've just put a couple of them on the next slide. So what can we do? We need to monitor and respond to it. So it's not good enough for kids to be teased. We need to nip the small things in the bud. Just on that, I had a teacher call me just before I started my PhD to talk about some bullying in her class. She was a prep teacher, a friend of a friend. And there in that class, they had the Skinny Girls Club. And if you weren't skinny, you weren't in the Skinny Girls Club. She was concerned about it. She was worried. She wanted to have a chat. And to be honest, this doesn't surprise me. This is 5-year-olds emulating what they see on TV, what they hear mum talking about, and that's that if you're thin, you're good, and if you're not, see you later. That's weight-based stigma. So obviously chatting to this teacher, she was keen to put a stop to it and to say no more. This is a line in the sand. That's what we need to do. If we say toughen up, they're just words, you'll be right, we're saying it's okay. So we need to address it in healthcare environments. Those of you going into a healthcare environment, great choice. But we need to think about the context of that and the patients we might be seeing. We also need to acknowledge with ourselves that the simplistic view of just eat less isn't working. It's not working. Why isn't it working? I'm going to have a think and a talk for the next 2 sections about some of the things that impact on people that mean it's not as simple as just eat less. And if it was, that's what we'd be doing. Food and the social determinants of health. The social conditions in which people are born, live, work is the single most important determinant of good health or ill health. That's luck, isn't it? Where you're born is luck. Did you have a say in where that was? No. I think it's really interesting to go back to that and really think about what that means in context. I've got a really good example to use about that, and it really fits into a couple of the domains of the social determinants of health. So we'll quickly look at those domains and I'll use my example. So the domains that are of particular concern, the neighbourhoods that we live in and that built environment, which I'll talk specifically in relation to physical activity soon, the health care that we receive and our health, how we access that, how literate we are in health literacy, the social and community context, so what reinforcement do we have, what support do we have if we're a young mum, say, education, so what education do we have to then make choices about our behaviours, it's a really interesting one, and economic stability, which underpins all of these issues. So rather than go on and on about each one, I'm just going to give you a little example of where the social determinants of health and those concepts really came into focus for me as a clinician. So I'm setting the scene. You're at Palm Beach Community Health Centre, just down the road, and you're seeing somebody, you're me. It's a child, you've got the referral, they're 10 years old, and on the referral it says obesity, and then it says pre-diabetes, insulin resistance. That's all it says. You also note that this child's 10 now, but when he was 5 and when he was 7, there was also referrals made to see a dietitian, and he hadn't been seen. So this is the first presentation at 10 years of age. There is also in the corner a scribble about his weight being 100 kilos or just over 105. So there's some significant issues there. I met Billy, his name is. He hardly looked at me. He was clearly full of shame. He couldn't speak. Mum was also obese. Mum spoke a lot and a lot about her own ailments. I listened. I felt sad for Billy. He's a child that clearly some of these social determinants of health haven't gone his way. Now, is that his fault at 10? Definitely not. What use is it for me to pop him on the scales and tell him he's 105 kilos? I know he's 105 kilos. It says it in front. Yes, it was done 2 weeks ago. It's of no benefit. What I did do is ask Billy about what things he liked at school. Didn't tell me anything. And it was a really hard consult. It was tricky. Mum talked incessantly, I said, about her own health issues. And at the very end, she said, well, what can we do? What can we do for Billy? We don't want him to get diabetes like me. And I said, well, one thing you might want to do is switch over to drinking water, because they did mention that they drank a lot of juice and soft drink. And that's the only piece of advice I gave. They left, and I thought, I wonder if I'll see them again. The story continues. I saw Billy 6 weeks later with another family member that had moved into the house. A cousin of Mum's, because Mum had to go interstate. So now the cousin was looking after Billy. Billy came in with a water bottle, proudly popped it on my desk and sat there. And the cousin started to talk to me about Billy. The cousin started to talk about how she was walking to school now with Billy. The cousin started to talk about how one of his passions was rugby and he really wanted to play in the local team. He asked and they said he was too big to play and they didn't feel that was right for his age bracket. And the bottom line is that I then saw Billy 3 more times and progressively things improved for Billy. Why? Because he had someone there backing him. He had someone saying, well, eat what I eat. Hey, let's drink water. Let's go for a walk. And when you're 10, that's what you need. So no, it wasn't his primary parent, but it was a caregiver. So all of these things to do with social determinants of health came into play for me because I felt like, wow, this is the living, I don't need to sit there and say, this is what you should do with your diet. All I needed to say is, well done, that's fantastic. You're feeding him what you eat. That's great. And give them encouragement and talk to Billy about, gee, it'd be excellent to play rugby. What position do you want to play? As time went by, he ended up playing rugby and he lost 40 kilos. That talk is about environment. When we look at environment, we also need to think about how do people access food and what sort of food are they accessing? And now when I think about this slide in detail, I think about Billy and I think they were in poverty. Mum couldn't afford to have great food. I don't think that they actually had a vehicle to get to places. I started to put the pieces together and think, oh, this is really difficult stuff. So what is food insecurity and not having enough disposable income for food? It exists whenever the availability of nutritionally adequate, and that's a key point, and safe food, or the ability to acquire it in an accessible way, is limited or uncertain. That's food insecurity. Now, it is a spectrum, and it may be a temporary issue, or it may be a more permanent issue. The estimation from the literature is around that 12% of the population at some stage have some form of food insecurity. Are certain groups at risk? They surely are. So households with unemployment, Billy's mum. Single parent, Billy's mum. Low income, Billy's mum. Socially isolated, perhaps, I'm not sure. Cold. Indigenous. Certainly a higher risk of food insecurity issues. How does food insecurity then link to weight? You might think, oh, that doesn't kind of make sense. Let's just have a think about the elements. So if you're food insecure, i.e. you haven't got enough money to think about the next 4 days worth of food, what are you going to do to make it stretch? There's a few things you can do. You can decrease the quality and increase the quantity so you've got enough to feed your kids and their tummies are full. But by decreasing the quality, you're then making some sacrifices in terms of nutrients, aren't you? You're probably buying things that have less nutritional value but fill you up more. You might be using emergency food relief. And I don't know if any of you have seen what is in a package or a basket or a food parcel. I certainly have. And I've certainly looked at it in regards to my eyes thinking, wow, there's a lot of processed food in here. Now there's processed food in there because that's what's donated and it's stable. So you can't really put in your great bunch of bananas into a food parcel that might not go out until next week. So there's issues there in terms of the quality of food. So if that's what you've got, that's what you've got. Your choices are much more limited. So obviously that's going to lead to excessive weight if there's issues in terms of sourcing those other foods. Household chaos, that's linked too. So fewer resources. Transport might be a problem. You mightn't have grandma and grandpa around the corner to assist when times are tough. So socially, you could be pretty isolated. There's also an evidence base at the moment looking at binge eating and linking that to food insecurity, because it's really hard to set a nice logical timetable of when you're going to eat if it's so erratic and up in the air. You might have 1 week of feast, the next week of famine when there's no money. So your idea of binge eating becomes more prominent because you're eating when it's there and when it's available, and you're worried that it mightn't be there next week. I've also spoken to a young woman who has a binge eating disorder who said, in my house, it was really important when there was food available to eat as much as you could, and that was encouraged. Culturally, we wanted to all feel really full and feel like we'd been have a loving, great family environment to eat a meal at. So this idea of overeating was encouraged because when there's food there, you eat it. It's complicated. The other factor to look at in the environment is how physically active are we? So when we look at those scales, the input in and the input out, activity is one of the ways we can do that. And as you all know, we've really transitioned as humans from a real agricultural, let's get the wheat and grind it and make our own bread, very labour intensive way of living, to the Industrial Revolution, where we're in factories and we're still doing a lot of labour, to the digital age. The digital age. Say no more. We have smart TVs, we have smart washing machines and smart goodness knows what else. But our time at the moment for using up energy, everything's shortcut. Everything's the smallest possible amount of energy. The car, a major one. So our environments have really shifted to make it much more difficult in daily life just to get those steps. You know, the 10,000 steps? It's hard. The other big one for kids and families is screens. Screens. I have a colleague and he routinely asks people and families, how many screens do you have in your place? And he has a record of someone telling him 11. This was a 10-year-old. 11. So this is what they have access to, a lot of screens. And so that cuts down the rest of the time. The other really interesting area that I'm quite passionate about is urban planning. So if you think about how our new estates or our new suburbs might be divided, it's all about making the most cash from that block of land when you sell it. So the latest housing developments are around 600 square metres. And what fascinates me about this is the house takes up just about the entire block. And what they do is they leave a 2 metres at the back, between the back door and the back fence. So you can put a little, not a Hills Hoist clothesline, but a small little wash area. That's it. 2 metres. Out the front it's 4 because that's a car width to put your car in the driveway. That is it. And you might think, oh, that's okay, you can go down to the park. But can you? How do you get to the park? You've got a baby and a toddler, dad's at work with a car. How do you get to the park? It's not that simple. Some countries are doing better at this in terms of urban design and planning. And the Nordic countries are doing some lovely stuff, but yeah, that's another talk in itself. But I think we need to think about environments and how they might shape people's access and the cost in order to do some of these things. Maybe we need to raise taxes. Maybe we need to think about, well, we'll put a bit more time and effort into urban planning and get more green space. I don't know. I haven't got the answers. The other important thing to look at, I guess, in terms of the environment is just the amount of calories that are around and available for people and the advertising that goes with this. So in dietetic land, we like to call it empty calories or empty calorie foods. So it basically means they're calorie laden with not much nutrition there. So there's a lot of calories, but nothing else. They're often cheap. They're cheap to produce. And if you think about that, if you want to go and buy, I don't know, a kilo of sugar, it might cost you about $1 from Woolies. So if you think about that on a big scale, if you're going to be making soft drink and making sweets, it's really cheap to actually produce that. And so the profit margin's massive. So if you want to invest, that might be an idea. The other issue is the high satiety. So they fill you up. And the mouthfeel of fat has a certain mouthfeel that makes people feel good. So those things combined mean that these foods are going to be, well, they're going to be really accessible and also really tasty. The other issue is that advertising actually works. So the amount of money that's poured into that for a lot of these fast foods, it's done on purpose because it works. People buy them and the advertising linked to that. I was listening to some really interesting information only last week, just in regards to how much money is spent on marketing for foods. So we looked at one particular company, it was the Hartman Group, if you're interested in the detail. And this particular group only markets for food companies in the US, and their turnover last year was $16 million. So imagine just getting a slice of that to put into some of these preventative issues. I mean, we're nowhere near it. It is huge. So if we think about where they're targeting in terms of the fast food companies and where they're placed in the environment, often they're all put together, and you'll notice that they're in big kind of clumps. And the clump is known as a food swamp. Rose and colleagues, I've put the reference at the end, talk about the food swamp. And I was most interested to see that there's been a bit of backlash by the sort of ecology people saying they shouldn't be calling it a food swamp. That's sort of negative to swamps, which I found quite amusing when I put this picture on here. So there's a true swamp at the top. And obviously at the bottom, we've got what I'm talking about, a food swamp, where it's really difficult. You can see it's an urban area. That's actually in the States. And the food swamp is basically where we're inundated by these options of fast food, but there's not a lot else to choose from. And you might think, oh, there will be, just keep looking, keep hunting, you'll find something. The hunt for the sandwich. I can tell you it's difficult. I spent some time with a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old driving around America. And let me tell you, it is hard work finding a sandwich. You can go to a supermarket, sure, but how do I prepare that when I'm in a car and I'm driving? How do I have a chopping board? Really difficult to find fresh food. It just about did me in. So for those of you that want to get a true experience of food swamps, want to have a drive around the US, that's what you'll see. What's a food desert? I had somebody ask. Food desert's the scarcity. So it's where we've got supermarkets and grocery stores, but compared to the population, limited. So limited opportunity to get that fresh, unprocessed food. So the hunt for the sandwich continued, and I myself was struggling. I didn't end up finding one, and this is actually a true picture there, it's my 2 boys. There they are finding what we ended up finding as a sandwich. And they're laughing because day after day I was like, I just want a sandwich. It seems so basic. And even that, look at the size of it. Yep. I think this is a really good picture to actually think about. An environment that promotes high energy intake, sedentary behaviour, the reliance on cars is an obesogenic environment. There's many definitions, and this is just one from WHO. But that environment is what shapes people, and I guess it actually adds up to where they're going to head in terms of their behaviours. And as I found, I know all the information, I know what I want to eat for lunch, but if I can't find it in a hurry when I've got a 3-year-old that's crying because he's starving, yes, I'm going to buy the chips. And that's fine if you're on a holiday. Is that fine if it's day after day and that's what you've got? That's what's at your front door? I don't really think so. So I like this for a concluding statement. There's no single intervention that can halt the rise of the growing obesity epidemic. To successfully challenge childhood obesity requires addressing environmental issues, as well as the critical elements along that life course. Take-home messages, just a few. So, what can you take away from listening to me? Well, the top one is that this is a complex issue. It's not simply good enough to say, just eat less. Patronising, and it doesn't work. Weight stigma, not helpful, don't do it. Environments matter. Have a think about where we can make some changes here. And think about avoiding the food swamps. This is a reference list. Feel free to have a little look. Now would be the time when I'd say any questions. We're going to have a bit of a chat. But unfortunately today, not the case. Thanks for listening. See you later.